The iron mallet didn't just strike the oak of Gable End Manor, it shattered the fragile peace I had clung to since my father's heart stopped beating. I stood in the foyer, the scent of funeral incense still clinging to my mourning coat, my hands trembling as I faced the man who would become my nightmare. Pancras Vi, a cousin I had only heard of in hushed, fearful whispers, stood framed by a flash of Yorkshire lightning. He didn't offer condolences, he offered a scorched parchment that smelled of sulphur and malice. The Hallowell bloodline is a spent force, boy, he sneered, his shadow stretching across the portraits of my ancestors like a predatory bird. This will is the only one that matters now, and it says you are a trespasser in your own home. My voice caught in my throat, a dry rasp of disbelief. My father's intentions were clear. This house is my birthright. But Pancras merely laughed, a sound like grinding stones. Your father was a man of shadows, Osmund, and you are nothing but a legal ghost. Pack the silver you didn't earn. By dawn, the locks will be changed. I turned to the one person I thought would stand by me. Lumina Quayle ***, my betrothed. She stood behind Pancras, but she wasn't weeping. She was draped in a gown of shimmering emerald silk, a color far too bright for a house in mourning. Lumina, I whispered, reaching out. She stepped back, her eyes cold and calculating. A title under threat is no title at all, Osmund, she said, her voice devoid of the warmth I had once loved. I choose survival. Pancras has the manor, therefore, he has my hand. In that single, sickening moment, I realized I was utterly alone, a child without protection, stripped of my name and my love before the rain could even dry on my father's grave. The mud of the moors pulled at my boots as I stumbled away from the gates of my life. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing weight of betrayal. The rain was an icy shroud, blurring the world until a pair of lanterns cut through the gloom. A black carriage, devoid of any family crest or identifying mark, lurched to a halt beside me. The door swung open with a groan of iron, and a woman shrouded in heavy mourning lace leaned out. They lied to you, Mr. Hallowell, she whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to the howling wind. She introduced herself as the world had been rewritten to suit a villain's whims. I huddled in a corner of Tamsin's modest cottage as the bells of the village square began to toll, followed by the loud, rhythmic chanting of the town crier. Pancras had wasted no time. Every street corner was plastered with notices claiming that I, Osmund Hallowell, was not the legitimate heir, but the product of a sordid affair between my mother and a common stable boy. The shame was a physical blow, a brand upon my skin that I could almost feel burning. His trying to strip you of your humanity, Tamsin said, her jaw set in a grim line. But the nightmare deepened when a local lad brought news from the apothecary. The town doctor, a man who had once treated my childhood fevers, had been seen entering the manor with a heavy purse of gold. By noon, he had signed a revised birth certificate, officially documenting my illegitimacy with the weight of medical authority. I was no longer just homeless, I was legally non-existent, a shadow with no right to speak, no right to sue, and no right to exist in the eyes of the Queen's law. The villagers I had known my entire life now looked away when they saw me through the window, their faces twisted with a mix of pity and disgust. Pancras hadn't just taken my house, he had poisoned the very memory of my mother. I realized then that justice would not come from a courtroom that didn't recognize my name. I would have to find the truth in the dark corners Pancras thought he had cleared. Desperation drove us back to the manor under the cover of a moonless sky. My father once spoke of a priest hole hidden behind the library. I whispered to Tamsin as we crawled through a rusted cellar vent. The air inside Gable End was different now. It smelled of Pancras's expensive cigars and the stale rot of his presence. We moved like ghosts through the servants' passages, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a gunshot in the silence of the night. When we reached the library, my heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed the hidden latch behind the shelf of ancient law books, and the wall groaned open to reveal a cramped, dust-choked chamber. I expected gold or jewelry, something to fund our escape. Instead, I found a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with the meticulous. My breath hitched as I skimmed the entries. It wasn't a family history. It was a record of illegal debts, maritime fraud, and political blackmail. The Earl, one of the most powerful men in the North, was beholden to my father for reasons that smelled of treason. This was the leverage Pancras sought, not just the house, but the power to bring an earl to his knees. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked directly above us in the main library. A heavy shadow fell across the opening of the secret room. Pancras was standing only inches away, his breathing heavy, his presence a suffocating weight. I held my breath, clutching the ledger to my chest, knowing that if he looked down, our journey would end in blood. We escaped the manor by the narrowest of margins, fleeing into the damp sanctuary of a nearby hayloft. I was shivering, not from the cold, but from the realization that I was holding a weapon that could destroy an empire. Tamsin sat across from me, the lantern light flickering in her eyes. "You cannot fight an earl and a murderer as a fugitive, Osmund," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent hum. "The law will only listen to a man of standing, or a man with an estate to protect." She looked at me with a startling, clinical clarity. "My father left me a hidden estate, a small tract of land and a title that Pancras does not know exists. But as a woman, I cannot use it to bring a lawsuit in the High Court." Then came the proposal that altered everything. "Marry me," she said. It wasn't a plea for romance, it was a tactical strike. "If we marry, my father's estate becomes yours by law. It provides you the standing to sue Pancras and the funds to hire the barristers we need. It is a contract of vengeance." I looked at her, seeing the scars of the same grief I carried. There was no soft music, no bended knee, only the smell of dry hay and the distant baying of hounds. "I am a bastard lord in the eyes of the world," I replied, my voice steadying. "And you are the daughter of a man he silenced. If this is the only way to see him burn, then I take this alliance. I, Osmund Hallowell, take you, Tamsin Jory, until the blood is settled." We shook hands, a grim pact sealed in the shadows, unaware that this marriage of necessity would become the only thing keeping us alive. 3 nights later, I returned to my own home, but not as the master. I wore the stiff, itchy wool of a footman's uniform, my face obscured by the low-hanging brim of a hat and the shadows of the servants' entrance. Pancras was hosting what he called a victory ball, a lavish celebration of his stolen status. The halls were filled with the very people who had turned their backs on me. I moved through the glittering crowd with a tray of crystal flutes, a ghost among the living. I caught sight of Lamina, draped in my mother's favorite lace, her laughter ringing hollow as she leaned into Pancras. I felt a surge of indignation so hot it threatened to break my disguise. As I passed them, leaning in to refill their glasses, I heard Pancras whisper, "The carriage leaves at midnight for the north. We must dispose of the prisoner before the circuit judge arrives." Mallow demands silence. My heart froze. A prisoner? My father was dead. I had seen the casket. Who were they hiding? In my shock, I stumbled, splashing a dark red wine across Lumina's pristine skirts. She shrieked, striking out at me. As I knelt to clean the mess, murmuring apologies in a feigned rural accent, my fingers caught the glint of the Hallowell sapphire on her hand. With the dexterity of a man who had nothing left to lose, I slipped the ring from her finger. It was the key to the family vault, a symbol of the title she had so easily discarded. She didn't even notice it was gone until I had disappeared back into the kitchens, the weight of the gem a small, cold victory in my pocket. Tamsin waited for me in the darkened carriage at the edge of the estate. When I showed her the sapphire, she didn't smile. She pointed to the ledger we had taken from the priest hole. "Look at the ink, Osmund. Look closer." Under the magnifying glass, the dark lines didn't look like standard soot ink. They had a brownish, metallic sheen. "It's iron gall," she whispered, "but it's been thinned with something organic. This is your mother's handwriting, and she wrote this in her own blood." My stomach churned as I realized the depths of the horror. My mother hadn't died of a sudden fever, as I had been told. The ledger was a diary of a slow, systematic poisoning of the Hallowell line. She had documented the symptoms, the bitter taste in the tea, and the way my father's mind had begun to slip. She was trying to warn me, even as her own life ebbed away. But the final entry, written in a frantic, jagged hand, was the one that shattered my reality. Asterisk Gideon is not dead. The casket is a lie. He is moved to the place of the silent bells. Asterisk my father, the man I had mourned, the man whose grave I had wept over, was alive. Pancras hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He had kidnapped my father and staged a funeral to secure his hold on the title. The prisoner in the north Pancras had mentioned at the ball wasn't a political rival. It was my father. The revelation spurred us to action. We needed to know what poison had been used, for if my father was still alive, he was likely still being drugged into compliance. We sought out the local apothecary, a man named who lived in a shop that smelled of formaldehyde and dried herbs. He was a nervous man, his eyes darting to the shadows as I showed him the symptoms described in my mother's ledger. "I know this brew," he whispered, his hands shaking. "It's a tincture of mandrake and lead. It mimics death, then induces a permanent fog of the mind." But as he reached for a reference book, his expression suddenly shifted from fear to a predatory gleam. He looked past me toward the door. Before I could turn, he let out a blood-curdling scream. "Murderer! Help! The bastard has returned to kill again." I looked down and saw my own hunting knife, the one I had left at the manor, lying on the counter next to the cooling body of the apothecary's apprentice, who had been hidden behind the curtain. Pancras had anticipated my move. He had framed me for a fresh murder to ensure the law would hang me before I could ever reach a judge. The shrill, piercing blast of a constable's whistle echoed through the narrow street outside. "Run!" Tamsin cried, grabbing the ledger. We scrambled out the back window just as the front door was kicked off its hinges. We were hunted animals now. Every shadow and hardy on the hill held a pair of eyes looking for the bastard killer. We found refuge in the most unlikely of places, the dilapidated greenhouse at the edge of the Hallowell woods. It was Adna who had been struck mute by a stroke years ago. He had seen me grow up, and though he couldn't speak, his eyes held a lifetime of loyalty. He ushered us into a hidden crawl space beneath the potting benches as the search parties passed by, their torches flickering through the glass panes. When the silence returned, Balthazar reached into a hidden pocket of his apron and handed me a single, wilted flower. I looked at it, confused, until Tamsin gasped. "It's the antidote, Osmund. My father's notes mentioned it. Hellebore in small doses can counteract the mandrake fog." Balthazar then pulled out a tattered map of the county. With a gnarled finger, he pointed to a remote, jagged cliffside known as Astor. There, marked with a small, ink-stained cross, was a private asylum for the incurably insane. My father was being held in a fortress of madness, and the only way to save him was to walk directly into the heart of the enemy's territory. Balthazar gripped my hand, his silent vow of protection the first bit of warmth I had felt in days. To reach Crow's End, we had to get to London first to secure the legal injunctions that would prevent Pancras from simply having us shot on sight. We boarded the midnight express, huddling in a third-class carriage filled with coal dust and the desperate dreams of the poor. Tamsin clutched the ledger as if it were a holy relic. "Once we reach the High Court, the local constabulary has no power," she reassured me. "We will be under the protection of the Queen's bench." But the constables chasing us weren't interested in the law. As the train gathered speed, chugging through the dark Yorkshire valleys, I saw silhouettes moving along the roof of the carriages. These weren't men of the law, they were the brutes of Bury, a gang of hired killers Pancras kept on his payroll. They had bypassed the police entirely. The glass of our compartment window suddenly shattered, a lead bullet whistling past my ear. I shoved Tamsin to the floor as the door was kicked open. A man with a scarred face and a stolen constable's jacket lunged at me with a heavy cudgel. I fought with the desperation of a man who had seen his father's ghost. I managed to throw him from the moving train, but the victory was short-lived. A second shot rang out from the roof, grazing my shoulder. As the train roared into a tunnel, plunging us into total darkness, I realized that London wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap. We arrived in London as ghosts, covered in soot and blood. The city was a sprawling leviathan of smoke and noise, a place where a man could disappear or be swallowed whole. I led Tamsin to a part of the city even the sun seemed to avoid. There, hidden behind a row of crumbling warehouses, stood a narrow townhouse my father had kept under the name of a deceased servant. The lock was rusted, but as I turned the key, the mechanism clicked with a familiar, heavy thud. I expected a tomb. Instead, I found a fortress. The windows were shuttered with iron, and the air was thick with the smell of gun oil. A lantern flickered to life in the hallway, revealing 5 men armed with heavy naval carbines. "Identify yourself," the leader backed, his voice like grinding gravel. I stood tall, despite my rags. "I am Osmund Hallowell, son of Gideon. I have the ledger." The men immediately lowered their weapons, their faces softening into expressions of grim relief. "We are the *** Order of the Anchor ***, the man said. "Your father saved our lives at sea when the Earl of Mallow would have seen us drown for insurance money. We've been waiting for the true heir to call us to arms." I wasn't just a child without protection anymore. I was the leader of a small, vengeful army. While the order prepared for our strike on the asylum, I explored the upper floors of the townhouse. In a room hidden behind a false wardrobe, I found something that turned my blood to ice. It was a nursery, perfectly preserved, but there were 2 cribs, not one. I found a baptismal record tucked into a Bible. I had a twin. Her name is Astrid, having followed me up. My father's papers mentioned a second heir hidden away because of the Salic law of the estate. The Hallowell title can only pass to a male, but if you died, the estate would have gone to the crown, unless there was a twin to maintain the line in secret. The Order's scouts returned with a devastating update. They had found Keziah. She wasn't in hiding. She was a patient at the very asylum where my father was held. I went to the sanatorium under the guise of a visiting physician. When I found her cell, my heart stopped. She looked exactly like me, the same high cheekbones, the same dark, intelligent eyes, but she was skeletal, her arms bruised from repeated injections. "Keziah," I whispered. She bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't let Pancras give me the needle again," she screamed. I won't sign the transfer." I had to hold my breath to keep from crying out as I realized the depth of Pancras's depravity. He wasn't just holding my father, he was using Keziah as a spare. Because she was my twin, her signature on legal documents was nearly identical to mine. He had been forcing her to sign away parcels of the estate, piece by piece, to the Earl of Mallow to pay off his own gambling debts. "Keziah, it's Osmund. Your brother," I said, reaching through the bars. Her hand was cold, her pulse thrumming like a trapped bird. "He told me you were dead," she sobbed. "He said he'd kill father if I didn't sign the papers." She pointed a trembling finger at the floor. "He's in the cell beneath me, Osmund. I can hear him coughing at night. But the floorboards are reinforced with iron. There is no way down." A heavy footstep echoed in the corridor. An orderly, a man the size of a draft horse, appeared at the end of the hall. "Visiting hours are over, Doctor," he grunted, his hand sliding toward a heavy set of keys at his belt. I knew if I left now, I might never get back in. I lunged at him, the rage of 20 years fueling my strike. We crashed into the stone wall, a brutal, silent struggle in the shadows of the madhouse. I managed to knock him unconscious, but as I grabbed his keys, I realized they were for the upper floors only. The cells below were controlled by a single master key, a key that was currently being sold at a private auction of Hallowell curiosities in the city. The auction was a grotesque display of my family's ruin. Pancras was selling off everything, my mother's jewelry, my father's maps, and even the medical cabinet from the manor which contained the master keys to the estate's various properties, including the asylum's high-security wing. I arrived disguised as a foreign count, my face partially hidden by a silk mask, a common affectation for the eccentric wealthy. Tamsin was by my side, her poise unbreakable. "We must bid for the cabinet," she whispered. "If Pancras sees a local bidding, he'll get suspicious." The bidding started high. I watched as men in top hats bartered for my childhood memories. My heart hammered as the auctioneer moved to the cabinet. 500 guineas. I called out, my voice steady. Pancras, sitting in the front row with Lamina on his arm, turned to look at me. His eyes narrowed, searching my face. 600, he counted, just to be cruel. I felt Tamsin's hand grip my arm. We couldn't outspend him with the little gold we had left. But then, Lamina whispered something in his ear, and he laughed, waving a hand dismissively. "Let the foreigner have the junk. I have the land." The hammer fell. I had the keys. But as I turned to leave, Lamina's eyes met mine through the mask. She didn't scream. She simply smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips that told me she knew exactly who I was. I was barely a block away from the auction house when a hand reached out from a dark alley and pulled me into the shadows. I drew my pistol, but a familiar scent of rosewater stopped me. It was Lamina. She was trembling, her expensive silk gown torn at the hem. "Don't kill me, Osmund," she sobbed, falling to her knees. "I did it for you. I stayed with him to find where he hid the key to your father's chains." I didn't believe her for a second. "You chose survival, remember?" I spat. She reached into her bodice and pulled out a small gold locket. She snapped it open to reveal a lock of gray hair, freshly cut and tied with a black thread. "Is moving him tonight," she whispered, her voice thick with genuine terror. "Pancras realized the order of the anchor is in London. He's taking your father to the East India docks to put him on a ship. Once he's on the water, he'll be lost at sea for good. If you want to save him, you have to go now. Kill Pancras, or lose your father forever." She handed me a scrap of paper with a pier number. Was it a trap? Or was it the last shred of her conscience finally breaking through? I had no choice but to find out. The London docks were a nightmare of fog and rotting timber. I moved through the crates of spice and silk with the order of the anchor at my back. We reached Pier 19 just as a small rowboat was being lowered into the black, oily water of the Thames. I saw a slumped figure in the back of the boat, his head covered by a sack. "Pancras!" I roared, stepping into the light of a lone oil lamp. The man in the boat turned, but it wasn't Pancras. It was a decoy. From behind a stack of barrels, a group of armed men stepped out, led by the Earl of Mallow himself. He looked at me with the bored indifference of a god. "Lumina is a very gifted actress, isn't she?" the Earl said, his voice smooth and cold. "She didn't betray you to Pancras, boy. She betrayed you to me." I realized then the true hierarchy of the conspiracy. Pancras was just the Earl's dog. "Your father owes me a debt that can only be paid in blood and silence," the Earl continued, raising a hand. "You have the ledger. Give it to me, and perhaps I'll let your sister live. Refuse, and you can join your father in the river." "The ledger is worth more than my life, Earl," I shouted, my voice echoing off the damp stone of the pier. "It contains the record of the Lady Isabella the ship you sank for the insurance money." The Earl's face paled slightly. This was the maritime scandal my father had discovered. In a sudden flash of memory, I saw my father's face from years ago, telling me stories of the sea. He hadn't been a criminal, he had been a whistleblower. He had scuttled the ship himself to prevent the Earl from drowning hundreds of Irish immigrants just to collect a payout on a lost cargo of opium. My father was a fugitive from the Earl's corrupted law, but a hero in the eyes of God. "I don't want your estate, boy," the Earl hissed, his composure breaking. "I want that book. It is the only thing that can hang me." He signaled his men to fire. But the order of the anchor was faster. A volley of lead erupted from the shadows as my father's loyalists engaged the Earl's mercenaries. In the chaos, I dove into the water, swimming toward the boat where I thought my father was hidden. But the boat was empty. The sack contained only stones. It was a double blind. I washed up on the mudflats of the Thames, shivering and defeated. Tamsin found me hours later, bringing me back to the safe house. As she stitched the gash on my shoulder, the silence between us grew heavy. "I only proposed to save my father's name," she said softly, her fingers trembling against my skin. "I thought this was just a legal battle. But seeing you out there, Osmund, I would follow you to the gallows." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman who had sacrificed everything for a man she barely knew. "Your father didn't die in an accident, did he?" I asked. She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the soot on her cheek. "Pancras pushed him. He told me he'd do the same to me if I ever spoke of the duplicate will." In that moment, the contract of vengeance dissolved, replaced by a bond forged in fire. I leaned in, and we shared a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, a brief moment of peace before the final war began. We weren't just two orphans anymore, we were a family, and we would fight for the one we had left. "We find the ledger's secret," I vowed, "and then we burn his world down." The next morning, London was rocked by a massive explosion. Pancras, realizing the order was closing in, had set fire to the High Court of Records. "If I can't be the heir, there will be no Hallowells left in the books," he had reportedly shouted to the mob. He was trying to erase our history, to make the bastard brand permanent. Tamsin and I watched the smoke rise from the distance. "He thinks he's won," I said, pulling the ledger from my coat. "But he forgot one thing." I took a candle and held a page of the ledger over the flame. Tamsin gasped, trying to pull it away, but I held firm. As the heat hit the vellum, a secondary layer of ink began to appear. My mother, a master of chemistry, had treated the pages with alum and lemon juice. The blood ink was a decoy, the real secret was hidden beneath. It wasn't a list of debts. It was a map of Gable End Manor, showing a series of tunnels that even the builders had forgotten. And there, marked in the very center of the house, was a chamber labeled, *the heart of the bloodline. He's not in an asylum, Tamsin, I realized. He's back at the manor. He's been in the walls the entire time. We traveled back to Yorkshire in secret, moving by night and hiding by day. The order of the anchor stayed behind to distract the Earl's men, leaving only Tamsin and me to finish the task. We were met at the edge of the estate by an unexpected messenger, the Earl's own butler, an elderly man named Fenwick. He handed me a silver tray, upon which sat a single, crumpled note. "The Earl is a monster, Mr. Hallowell," Fenwick whispered, his voice shaking. "But even a monster has servants who remember kindness. Your father once paid for my daughter's surgery when the Earl would have let her die. He is in the manor, locked in the widow's cell behind the ballroom chimney." The irony was a bitter pill. I had been searching the whole country for my father, while he was mere inches away from me the night of the Victory Ball. He had been listening to the music, listening to the laughter of the man who had stolen his life, trapped in the very stone of his ancestors. "He's in the walls, Osmund," Fenwick warned. But Pancras has rigged the vents with coal gas. If you use a lantern, the whole house goes up. You must go in dark. The tunnels were cold, damp, and smelled of ancient earth. I moved by touch, my fingers tracing the rough-hewn stone of the manor's foundation. Tamsin followed close behind, her hand on my shoulder. We reached the ballroom chimney, and I felt for the hollow brick my mother's map had indicated. I pushed with all my might, and the wall gave way with a silent, heavy slide. Inside, the air was thick and sickly sweet, the coal gas. I saw a figure huddled on a pallet of straw, his beard long and white, his eyes glazed with the mandrake fog. "Father!" I whispered, my heart breaking. Gideon Hallowell looked up, but he didn't see me. He was staring at a stack of parchment on a small desk. Pancras had been forcing him to forge Hallowell bonds, loans against the estate that would funnel money directly into Pancras's offshore accounts. My father was a slave to his own name. I grabbed the black hellebore Balthazar had given me and pressed the crushed petals against his lips. "Drink, father. Please." He coughed, his eyes suddenly clearing with a terrifying, sharp intelligence. "Osmund," he gasped, his voice a ghost of the man I remembered. "Did you bring the seal? We have to stop the signing. The land isn't ours." The village of Hardy on the Hill was gathered at the cemetery for the reconsecration of my father's grave, a publicity stunt Pancras had arranged to show his piety. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the gravediggers began to exhume the casket. "Stop!" I roared, stepping forward. The crowd gasped, parting like the Red Sea. Pancras stood by the open grave, his face turning a mottled purple. "The killer returns," he shouted. "Constables, seize him." But the villagers stayed still. They wanted to see what was in the box. I shoved the diggers aside and wrenched the lid open with a crowbar. There was no body inside. Instead, the casket was filled with heavy gold bars, each stamped with the Earl of Mallow's private seal. "This is the debt the Earl wanted," I shouted to the crowd. "Pancras didn't just steal my house. He used my father's death to smuggle the Earl's illegal opium profits out of the city. Your lord is a common thief and a smuggler." The murmurs of the crowd turned into a roar of indignation. Pancras looked at the gold, then at me, and I saw the first flicker of true, panicked fear in his eyes. The storm that had been brewing over the moors finally broke. Thunder shook the very ground as Pancras drew a pistol, pointing it directly at my chest. "It doesn't matter what's in the box if you're dead, boy." The constables, finally realizing they had been duped, hesitated. Suddenly, a carriage roared into the cemetery, Tamsin standing on the driver's seat. She held a scroll high above her head, the royal seal of the Queen's Bench trailing in the wind. "A writ of habeas corpus," she screamed. "By order of the High Court, the person of Gideon Hallowell is to be produced, and all assets of the Hallowell estate are frozen." Pancras's face went white. He knew the law was finally faster than his lies. "That paper is a forgery," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I am the master here." He fired his pistol, the bullet whistling past my ear and striking the headstone of my mother's grave. In the chaos that followed, Pancras turned and fled into the darkness of the woods, toward the manor. He was a cornered rat, and he was heading for the only hole he had left. We pursued him through the rain, a mob of villagers and the few honest constables left following our lead. Tamsin stayed by my side, her face set in a mask of iron. We reached the manor just as Pancras barred the main doors. "Open the doors, Pancras," I shouted, hammering on the oak. "It's over. The Earl has already fled to France. You have no one left." From inside, I heard a manic, high-pitched laugh. "I have the match, Osmund. If I can't have Gable End, no one will." I remembered the coal gas. If he struck a light, the entire manor would become a funeral pyre for my father and my sister, who were still trapped in the secret wing. I signaled the order of the anchor, who had finally arrived from London. They used a battering ram to splinter the side entrance. We burst into the foyer, only to find it filled with the constables, who were actually Pancras's thugs. A brutal, close-quarters struggle erupted in the very halls where I had played as a child. We fought room by room, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and ancient dust. We disarmed the last of them, but Pancras was gone. He had vanished into the secret tunnels. We found my father and Keziah in the widow's cell, huddled together as the smell of gas grew stronger. Tamsin helped them out of the manor as I turned back to find the source of the leak. I found Pancras in the library, holding a single, guttering candle over an open gas valve. "One step closer, and we all go to hell," he hissed. But my father, leaning on the doorway, spoke in a voice that shook the room. You don't even know what you're fighting for, Pancras. Gideon stepped forward, pulling back his sleeve to reveal a tattoo I had never understood, a series of numbers and maritime coordinates. The land, my father gasped. The king's grant, it was never Hallowell land. My grandfather stole it from the Joy family 100 years ago. That's why your father's clerk was killed, Tamsin. He found the original grant. The twist was a physical blow. My family's entire legacy was built on a lie. We weren't the rightful heirs, Tamsin was. The land belongs to the Joys, Gideon whispered. We are the usurpers. Pancras stared at the tattoo, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He had spent his life murdering for a title that didn't legally exist. In his rage, he dropped the candle. I lunged, catching it just inches from the floor, but the flame licked against a pile of papers. The grant, Tamsin cried. If it burns, the land goes to the crown. Pancras, seeing his last chance at power vanishing, didn't try to save himself. He grabbed the burning papers and ran toward the back of the manor, toward the Jory ancestral cottage that sat on the edge of the estate. He's going to burn the evidence. I leaped onto my horse, racing through the storm. I saw the cottage engulfed in flames, a beacon of malice on the mow. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. I jumped from the saddle through the front window of the burning house. The heat was a wall, the smoke a blindfold. I saw Pancras slumped in the corner, clutching a metal box to his chest, his clothes catching fire. Give it to me. I screamed. He looked at me, a final, twisted smile on his face, and threw the box into the heart of the inferno. I plunged my hands into the embers, the pain screaming through my nerves as I retrieved the metal box. I fell out of the burning cottage just as the roof collapsed, the heat searing the back of my coat. I lay in the mud, gasping for air, clutching the scorched box to my chest. Back at the manor, the magistrate had arrived, along with a sea of witnesses. Pancras, miraculously still alive but horribly burned, was dragged into the foyer in chains. He looked at the magistrate, his voice a raspy croak. Sign the deed. I am the only male heir left. Osmund is a bastard, and the Hallowell name is mine. I stood up, covered in soot and blood, and opened the metal box. I pulled out the original king's grant, signed in 1712. The name Hallowell doesn't own this land, I declared, my voice ringing with a triumphant roar. This grant proves the Joy family are the true lords of Gable End. Tamsin is the owner, and I am merely her protector. Pancras sneered, a final, desperate act of Victorian misogyny. A woman cannot own land. The law says. The law says the blood must be true, I interrupted, stepping close to him. I held up my right hand. It was shaking, a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that I had possessed since birth. My father held up his hand. It shook with the exact same frequency. Keziah's hand did the same. This is the Hallowell tremor, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. It is a rare hereditary trait, passed from father to child for 5 generations. It is our mark of legitimacy. I grabbed Pancras's hand. It was as steady as the stone of the floor. You aren't a Hallowell, Pancras. You aren't even a distant cousin. You are an impostor who murdered the real Pancras years ago in a London fog and took his name to prey on my father's weakness. The magistrate froze, his pen hovering over the parchment. He looked from my shaking hand to Pancras's steady one. Explain yourself, Cousin Vi, he demanded. Pancras opened his mouth to lie, but the silence in the room was absolute. The game was over. The final blow came from the shadows. Lamina Quayle stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes sharp. She wasn't holding a silk handkerchief, she was holding a small, blue glass vial. He forced me to help him, she cried, but I kept the evidence. This is the poison he used on the real Pancras Vi. I found it in his private desk. The twist was the final nail in his coffin. Lamina hadn't been spying for me, and she hadn't been loyal to the Earl. She had been gathering enough evidence to blackmail whoever won. But seeing the fire and the blood, she had realized that there was no profit in a dead man's secrets. Pancras let out a howl of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged for Lumina's throat, his burned hands like claws. I stepped between them, meeting his charge with a solid, crushing blow to the jaw. He fell to the floor, a broken, pathetic heap of ambition and malice. You took my name, I whispered, looking down at him. But you could never take the blood. The sun rose over the moors, casting a long, golden light over Gable End Manor. The horror of the night was replaced by a quiet, somber peace. Pancras Vi, or whoever he truly was hauled away in a prison carriage, destined for the gallows or the penal colonies of the South. The Earl of Mallow was stripped of his title by the High Court, his crimes finally brought to light by the ledger my mother had written in blood. Lumina was vanished, exiled from society with nothing but the clothes on her back, her name a cautionary tale in every drawing room in England. As for me, the fate of my family had been altered forever. I stood on the balcony with Tamsin, watching my father and Keziah walk through the gardens, finally free of the fog. "You are the lady of the manor now," I said to Tamsin, taking her hand. She looked at me, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips. "And you are a commoner with a shaking hand," she teased. I laughed, the sound light and free. I had given my title to Keziah, ensuring that the Hallowell name would continue through a woman of strength. I chose to remain a Joey, marrying Tamsin not out of necessity, but out of a love that had survived the dark. The child without protection had become the man who protected an entire legacy. Justice, though delayed by shadows and lies, was never denied.